Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We are talking to journalist, data scientist, and homicide archivist Thomas Hargrove about why we're one of the only developed nations that doesn't keep track of murders. I mean, if you can even fathom that, but I guess he's going to tell us that we don't. How his organization is suing the federal government for violating a federal law that mandates the government report murders. His algorithm to identifying serial killers, and how he discovered a tipping point where a high number of unsolved murders will cause a murder surge. So sit back, put your seatbelt on, and let's go.
You know that we're in the middle of a murder surge.
Really?
Starting in 2020, the gross number of homicides in America increased nearly 30%. That's the largest one-year record in the history of the Uniform Crime Report, which has been around since 1930.
What do you attribute it to?
Yeah, so the spark, quite clearly, if you look at the data and you break it down by weekly counts of murder, the spark was the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis by a police officer. The spike occurred exactly in that week. And that comes down to a theory of criminology called procedural justice, that when a growing number of people decide that the system is not procedurally fair, I'm not being treated fairly, that there becomes a growing suspicion that police are not legitimate. That lack of legitimacy prompts people not to trust police, not to call police when something bad has happened, not to cooperate with investigations, to withdraw from the partnership. I mean, we're all in a partnership in law enforcement. The police investigate, and we, the people, have to assist and cooperate with that investigation. When that cooperative partnership devolves to the point that it's not a relationship at all, nothing good happens. And so that same year, we hit an historic low. Only 54% of homicides were cleared that year, the worst on record. So it's literally the most vicious of vicious circles, and we're not done spiraling yet. The murder surge continued in 2021, and based on preliminary data we're getting from the Centers for Disease Control, it continued into 2022, although we're still counting that year. But it looks like we're still in the surge.
Are we the most violent of all? I mean, where are we in a spectrum to get perspective?
Compared to the rest of the world,
Yeah,
we're a pretty violent place.
yeah.
Frankly, we would be astonished living in Europe how low the homicide rates are there. A few years ago, I had lunch with the senior homicide investigator for Denmark. And I asked him, an insightful question: how many murders does Denmark have a year? And he told me, about 50. And I just about choked on my salad. And I asked, well, good heavens, how many of those do you clear through arrest? And he said about 48 or 49.
Wow.
And that's more than a 90% clearance
Right.
rate.
That's really right.
And I asked him, how could that possibly be? And he said, well, because every homicide comes across my desk. And if nothing has happened after a few weeks, I'll call down there and ask whether they need help. Should I come down there? And so this idea of oversight is possible when you have so few murders, that whatever resources are needed to clear the case, he'll provide. And he struck me as a really sharp cop. I would hate to kill someone and know that he was after me. So we don't have that in this country. Murder investigations are local. Police are underfunded just about everywhere. We don't have enough detectives. We don't have enough forensic technicians to go to the scenes. We don't have enough laboratory capacity. We don't have enough of everything.
Yeah.
That's something else I'd like to talk to you guys about.
Where else do you see it besides just because that's one measurement? Is it also crime in general up, in these places?
No. So that's a really good question. Generally speaking, property crimes are relatively stable and have been declining over time. Other kinds of crimes, robberies, burglaries, although robbery is technically a violent crime, we haven't seen a huge spike in that. It has been specific to aggravated assault, technically that's a failed murder, aggravated assault. So aggravated assault and homicide, those have been spiking.
Are they crimes of passion? I mean, these homicides, do we even know, or are they anonymous? In this spike?
Yeah, we're still studying what the hell is going on. They certainly do have a large and growing number of stranger on stranger crimes. These are not domestic violence cases. The overarching pattern is that these are increasingly black on black murders, that white victim murders have been declining. So this is happening primarily in the inner cities or in large urban areas. And it speaks to a total diminishment of the historic partnership between police and the community they serve. That relationship is spinning out of control. And nothing good happens when that happens. And nothing good happens when, in a growing number of cities, most killers are allowed to continue to walk the streets. When most murders go unsolved, the killer is available to kill again. Why not? He might want to tell people, I'm now a serial killer. Also, he inspires others because he's walking proof that there are no sanctions to murder. He got away with it. Finally, he killed somebody, and anyone who cared about that victim feels that they have to take the law into their own hand. So murder begets murder, especially unsolved murder.
Have there been other periods in history where you've seen similar sort of surge in statistics, maybe not as bad, but have there been other times?
Yeah, so there was a small surge right after Ferguson, Missouri, and the shooting death of Michael Brown. And that immediately sparked an argument among scholars. Is there really a Ferguson effect? The data were disputed. Finally, I think the majority of opinion among criminologists was, yes, there appears to be a Ferguson effect. Well, that argument disappeared entirely after the Floyd murder. The spike was so huge, no one could argue that something isn't going on. And the pattern of relationship to the timing of the Floyd murder, it just, without debate or dispute, George Floyd sparked an awful lot of violence. But during the Ferguson effect period, that was an open question. We have seen in the 90s a large increase in homicide, and that was primarily attributed to the growth in the crack cocaine industry, as street gangs would struggle for turf and market control because crack cocaine was very lucrative. That was an historic surge upon which there really was very little debate. Lately, there's been debate as to what's going on, although I think that argument is now largely subsiding following the death of George Floyd.
So how did you get into studying this sort of subject, and how would you define the subject that you study?
I'm the chairman and founder of the nonprofit Murder Accountability Project. You can see what we do at murderdata.org. And all we are is a bunch of nerds. We have some very impressive credentials on our board of directors. The former head of the National Center for the Study of Violent Crime at the FBI is on our board. We have other FBI analysts and police officials and investigators. But all we do is try to assemble the most complete accounting of homicide possible, and to make that ever as easily accessible as we can. We're hoping that data become a positive political force in America. We are trying to use information as a counter weapon to violence.
So if you look at Minneapolis now, where we had the strong, defund the police movement, and what do we see there in the aftermath of that, specific to Minnesota? Because I know they can't even really hire police to go in there now. Police just stand back and sort of let it all be,
We're praying that things are quieting down in Minneapolis. It's interesting. So we can study grand patterns with the data, and we recommend people to do just that. Every state that borders Minnesota, including Minnesota, with the exception of Michigan, but all of the other states that border Minnesota had historic rates of homicide in the last 2 years. They hit a record. Every state hit an all-time record, beyond even what we saw in the 1990s during the so-called crack cocaine wars. It seems to have been a geographic trend. It happened in almost all of America, if you want to call it the Minnesota effect, but it definitely happened in places with close proximity to Minneapolis. We don't fully understand that. I have a criminology professor who advises me, and he tosses out the theory that this could be partially an effect of news coverage, that places where proximity to Minneapolis is causing spikes in murders, you get a double dose. So there was the national story of George Floyd's murder and protests nationally. And then at the 5:30 news, at the local news, you got it again with the local demonstrations and the local murders rising. That's as good a theory as any. I can't think of why there is a geo effect, but just about every state that borders Minnesota had a record.
To go back to your point, you said that you were trying to use data more efficiently, effectively to help
Yes.
this. Could you explain what do you mean by that?
I'm not a retired cop. I'm a retired journalist. In fact, I used to be a White House correspondent, which is a terrible job. But most of my career was spent as an investigative journalist, which is the best job in the universe. And in 2010, after several years of whining that we should study unsolved murders in America, my bureau chief in Washington said, "Okay, Tom, you got a year to do this." And for 1 year, I studied cold cases and built a database for cold case murders, talked to hundreds of homicide detectives around the country. And I was shocked to find how few resources they have, starting with the lack of a national list. You go to most Western nations and ask, could you give me a printout of every unsolved murder? They can do that. We can't do that in this country. And so we're trying to build one. We're starting with FBI data, which was created as a scholarly tool to help us understand homicide. We take those data, we augment them with thousands of murders that were never reported to the FBI because the Uniform Crime Report is a voluntary program. And so hundreds of police departments opt not to report. So we try to make that obligatory by contacting them and using the Freedom of Information Act. Our argument is, Your Honor, the people of, and fill in the blank, Illinois or wherever, have the right to know how they're being murdered and whether those murders are being solved. And we've never lost that argument.
I don't know why. How can they not report? I don't even understand. Like, why are they not reporting it? What's in it for a police chief to not report it?
So
So
it's part of the. I think it's probably part of. Is this a side effect of gun violence in general? You know.
No. When Congress created the Uniform Crime Report in 1930, it made it a voluntary program. And so you don't have to do it. And there are no sanctions for not doing it. Over the years, the Justice Department tried to create a carrot. They couldn't use a stick, but they tried to create a carrot so that you don't qualify for federal assistance to law enforcement grants if you don't report to the Uniform Crime Report. And that helped. But it's always been a voluntary program. The best the UCR ever did, they captured about 90% of the nation's murders about 12, 14 years ago. That's the best they've ever done. It's been devolving since. And we've been trying to fill the gaps.
How can you be sure of what the numbers actually are? If people aren't reporting, how do you know that there's a surge?
Because, well, first the data show there's a surge.
But how do you make sure you get enough data?
Yeah. So that's an excellent question. There's a counter data reporting system. The Centers for Disease Control has developed what's called the Multiple Cause of Death Index. When we all die, we will each of us be a line item in this record. It is a database based upon the information gleaned from the nationally standard death certificate that the CDC created, so that whenever we die, our death will be recorded. If you die because of a homicide, that gets recorded. And unlike reporting by police to the FBI, You cannot lawfully dispose of human remains without having a death certificate. And all 50 states have mandated that the death certificate will be the standard that the CDC has created. So using these data, we have a pretty accurate picture as to how many Americans are dying.
So they're collecting all of they being the police collect all of the information, but they can elect not to share it with you if they want. And you've gone around to all the municipalities and basically sued them in order to make this information public. Yeah.
Correct. Also, the FBI, trying to improve the quality of the data, developed a new standard called the NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, which is a good idea, but it's much, much more complicated than the old UCR, the old Uniform Crime Report. And so they made NIBRS mandatory, starting with crime data in 2021. The rate of participation by police plummeted. Half of America went dark. Only 56% of the homicides that were committed in 2021 were reported to the FBI. And so we got really busy that year, and we contacted dozens of state and local law enforcement agencies asking that they continue to report to us data that they could not report under the new NIBRS standard. So when you come to murderdata.org, you are seeing, without question or debate, the most complete accounting of homicide available anywhere. And we make everything available.
So when you sit down with a police chief, I imagine your first thing is to make a phone call. You don't just start by suing them for the data. Like, what's that initial call like?
Begging, please. And it's usually an email, but we're not afraid to beg.
Yeah.
And we assure them that police are using these data every day, that we developed this data set as an asset to homicide detectives and their supervisors. The whole public, the whole world uses it, but it was primarily designed to be an asset to law enforcement. We make that argument, we say please, and we'll continue to beg right up until the point where our FOIA has been refused, and then we call the lawyers.
Can you give us an example? Don't tell us who it was, a conversation why they wouldn't do it. Like, did they ever say, hey, we're not doing this because, why wouldn't they be reporting? Have they?
No, we've never, in fact, we're in the middle of a very complicated lawsuit against the federal government. We're suing the FBI, we're suing the Department of Defense, we're suing, believe it or not, the Interior Department, because they run the National Park Police and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We're suing everyone that we can think of that might have primary investigative responsibility for homicides, because the federal government does not report homicides to the Uniform Crime Report in violation of a law Congress passed in 1988. Now, these cases have been going on for 4 years and they're still going on. It's very complicated. We are before U.S. District Judge Amy Berman Jackson, and she has not yet had to issue an order. We're hoping that we're still able to negotiate a settlement, but it's complicated and it's strange because you'd think the federal government, which runs the Uniform Crime Report, would obey a congressional act and provide data which Congress mandated that shall be provided, but they didn't. For decades, they did not report data. We hope our judge at some point will ask a representative of the federal government, why did you not obey the law? We don't know what the answer is.
Dude, a lot of times these things, are you tempted to write a story about them? You're a journalist. So do you start to see patterns and go, geez, maybe I should write that?
Yes, yeah, we have a news feed at our website, although that's not why we exist. I mean, our website, murderdata.org, is primarily a portal to the raw data so that you can call up what the clearance rate is in your hometown. If you lost a loved one to murder, you can probably find that record in our case files, and you can see how that murder compares to everything else. I mean, primarily our website is a portal to the data. But yes, we do write about patterns. There's a kind of magic to carefully counting things. And one of the things that we've developed is we have an algorithm that can identify serial murders. We continue to assure Chicago that they had probably 2 or 3 active serial killers from 2001 until at least 2018. We're still monitoring them, but there were 51 mostly African American women who were strangled and their bodies were left in abandoned buildings and empty alleyways. That was a very unnatural pattern. Less than 1% of the nation's population lives in Chicago, but 8% of the nation's unsolved strangulations of women occurred in Chicago. There are all kinds of red alerts, starting with our algorithm. As I say, there's a magic to carefully counting things. We will go public when we're quite convinced that the data are correct and that there's a pattern that people should know about. And we did so with Chicago. We will do that from time to time. You can go to our website, and we think we know who one of the killers is. And we, through FOIA, were able to get a video confession in which he said he killed far more people in Illinois than he did in Indiana. It was his pattern, his MO.
Is that Darren Dion Vaughn?
Yeah. You pronounce his name right. He spells it Van,
Yeah,
but he pronounces it Vaughn.
Yeah.
And so we hope that someday he'll do the right thing and allocute to his crimes.
How do you find that in the data? You find a pattern in what, so you're not just recording, here's a murder, you actually find out how the person, how do you discover that pattern in the data?
That's what the algorithm does. So the algorithm takes hundreds of thousands of murders. We're approaching now the million murder mark. It has records on hundreds of thousands of murders. It turns them into tens of thousands of groups, organizing them by the county where the homicide occurred, the gender of the victim, and the method of killing, how the victim was murdered. The algorithm then creates one more datum. It calculates in this group what was the clearance rate, and then it looks for clusters of similar murders in similar geographies that had a suspiciously low clearance rate.
What is a clearance rate?
A murder is cleared when at least one person has been arrested, formally charged with a crime, and handed over to a court of law for trial. That's the definition of clearance. A clearance rate is when you have a group of murders, what was the total number of clearances divided by the total number of murders. And generally speaking, we clear historically about 60% in recent years, although in the most recent years, it dropped down to 54%. But what's going on when you suddenly have a large group of women or men in which the clearance rate was nothing like that? It was like only 10% cleared or 15% cleared. The most charitable explanation is there's an uncaught serial killer active. Any other explanation really does not reflect well on law enforcement.
Have you gone to law enforcement and said, listen, we see this pattern, we see strangulation happening across the city, and it's maybe in different precincts, so they never catch it all together? They don't see the pattern?
Yeah, we actually have rules of engagement, how we do this. So when the algorithm goes red alert on something, the first step is to gather more information. So the records we get from the FBI or that we get from our Freedom of Information Act requests are anonymous. The name of the victim is not recorded, but there's no trouble using Google to figure out who the victim was. And so we put names and narratives to every murder in a cluster that the algorithm is giving us a red alert about. And then we look at those narratives, and usually it's pretty obvious, yes or no, could this be the work of a serial killer? It becomes astonishingly clear when you do this. When we have decided that, yes, the algorithm is correct, these are highly suspicious murders, they all look quite similar, then we, at a first step, contact the police and try to have a conversation with the chief of detectives or some sort of supervisor. We did that with Chicago, and they thanked us very kindly for the information, but nothing really happened. And so fortunately, news organizations started picking up the case. I made a conversation in a presentation I gave at IRE, the Independent Reporters and Editors group for investigative journalism. At a meeting, annual meeting in Phoenix, I said there are way too many unsolved strangulations in Chicago. And in the coming months, my phone would ring and it was Chicago journalists. wanting to know more about it. And so there were several waves of news stories which had a positive effect. Eventually, the Chicago police did put together a task force in cooperation with the FBI. The FBI agrees with us that these 51 women were not murdered by 51 separate men. That did not happen. There are oddities about the Chicago case in that very little DNA was recovered. Given that these are strangulations, physical murders, that's a bit of a mystery. But they don't have much proof, although there was one murder in which one of the killers were convinced is a white man who strangled a white woman and did leave DNA. And the DNA matched to another sexual assault of a different woman who was able to provide a description of his assailant. That's as close as you can get to confirmation of serial murder without actually checking the box, because right now we only have one rape and murder and one rape in separate cases.
Of those 51 women, for example, which is a horrific, it's beyond comprehension. Do you ever also reach out to the families of, so for example, those 51 families connected to those women presumably don't know that perhaps their loved one was a victim of a serial killer. Is there any advocacy that happens with, families coming in? Do you reach out? Do they take advantage of your organization?
Some of them have reached out to us. We published a report at the request of the Chicago City Council. We gave them a report in which we named all 51 victims and the particulars of their crime, the location of their crime, of their body recovery sites. And in some cases, the family has contacted us. I have to say that disproportionately, this group were involved in sex worker work, or they were illegal drug users, which are well-known targets of preference for serial murder. And these are often women who are already without family, that nobody chooses prostitution as a lifestyle. It's what you do when you have no other choices. And so they really didn't have much in the way of family to support to begin with, many of these women.
The first initial reports, the data, is the data all structured the same across the country, or is it different kinds of data get fed into it and then analyzed?
No, it's a very structured report. It's the Supplemental Homicide Report, which was created at the request of the International Association of Police Chiefs back in the 1950s. And so what is gathered is the age, race, sex, ethnicity of every victim, similar demographic information if an offender was arrested, the weapon that was used, the jurisdiction where the murder occurred, the month and year of the murder, basic information, and yet it's enough. It's enough for the algorithm to be able to parse through hundreds of thousands of murders, looking for clusters that have an elevated probability of being serial.
And is that one of the goals, to try and find serial killers in the data?
Yeah, again, back to the magic of carefully counting things. I think our primary goal is to try to convince Americans to stop killing each other. One of our mantras is, it doesn't have to be this way.
Right.
So we go around the country we have two target audiences. First are homicide detectives, and we've given many demonstrations to detectives how to use our data. Our other target group is the general public. And we tell people, come to murderdata.org, go to clearance rates, which is a tab, call up your town. Every hometown in America is there. And look at how many murders you have, and look at how often those murders get cleared. And if you don't like what you see, and increasingly you won't, if you don't like what you see, don't be quiet. Speak up, tell what you know. Have a conversation with your mayor, with your city council member, with your neighborhood association president. Be loud, because ultimately when a city makes clearing major crimes a priority, improvement occurs. And when you do a better job of clearing homicide, the homicide rate goes down so that fewer people die. And so it's a win-win. All you have to do is speak up. And we were hoping that the data alone become a political force in America.
Did you see the pattern of the Chicago strangulations before it was identified by the police? Did you get that before they saw a connection between them all?
Yes, and in fact, the police still don't make the presumption that they are connected. Officially, they're investigating these 51 murders independently. Publicly, they've said that they have no proof that these are connected murders.
So Samuel Little, the serial killer Samuel Little, how do you that you don't spot in the time nobody spotted it when it was going on? So then do you look retroactively to see what happened and aid the police? Is it a different way of thinking about it in that particular case?
Samuel Little was our nightmare scenario because he was a highly mobile serial killer. He didn't have a single place to kill. He wandered all over the country. He would kill and then move and then kill and then move, so that any method that uses geography as one of the testing points will fail. And so our algorithm is helpless against a killer like Little. We were contacted by the Texas Ranger who got Little to confess to 93 murders because he was having trouble IDing many of Little's victims. So we did the best we can with limited data. We think a great many of his victims were not reported to the FBI, but we provided what guidance we could. Yeah, we were involved, but Samuel Little caused us all sleepless nights because he got away with a massive amount of multiple murder for decades.
How many? Now, what's the context? Like when you finally got him, how old was he, and where? What's the bigger?
He's near you.
Stop it.
No, it was down in a Texas Ranger went to California. He'd been convicted in California of murdering 3 women.
In Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Really?
And so the Texas Ranger had a DNA match to one of theirs. And so he went and interviewed Little in prison. And Little spent the first half hour of the interview cussing and using every obscenity he knew, and he knew quite a few. But the Ranger did not quit. He stayed patiently. And after day 3, Little had confessed to murdering 93 women, which is a record.
Now, do we think that it's accurate, or do we think that, I mean, because I don't think he probably even knew the names of most of the people. So can we really ascribe all those things to him?
Nobody thinks he's lying. The FBI, who worked pretty hard on this one, they were able to make a hard link to, they've been able to name more than 60 of these victims.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody thinks he's lying.
Was there any pattern to the victims? You know, anything?
Strangled and
Like
disproportionately African American. But he was an opportunistic killer, as a great many serial killers are. When there was an available woman that was not in a public place, he would take advantage of the opportunity and kill them.
Atlanta has a lot of strangulations, you know, and do you see a pattern, you know, in the 90s, the 1990s, you know, is it do we think we got the person who did it? Are there multiple people who do it? Like, are there sometimes multiple serial killers that work in a given area?
Yeah, the algorithm went red alert big time in the Atlanta area with more than 100 unsolved strangulations of women. By the way, serial killers don't only strangle, but strangulation is a common method of killing for a serial killer because it's so hands-on. Atlanta still holds the record for the largest group of highly suspicious murders. We have had considerable press involvement in Atlanta. The Atlanta Police Department has looked at these cases. For a while, there was a killer who was leaving signed notes, Mr. X. I don't think we have anything like closure in those cases, and maybe never will.
Do you have to go and testify?
No.
No. So have you ever sat across from any of these serial killers and met one in person?
Never.
Yeah.
Never.
And
remember, I'm just a nerd, and so that's all I do.
Yeah. And how does it make you feel? I mean, it's obviously an incredibly important subject, but is it something that it's hard to study?
Yeah. What are your dreams like at night? That's all I was thinking.
I sleep fine.
Yeah.
Because the whole point of this exercise is to try to make murder rare. And so it is our goal to save human life. And so I sleep just fine. I do wish that America was not such a violent place. It does not have to be this way. It didn't used to be this way. We have hit hard times. We are angry at each other, and we are killing each other at rates that are just unheard of among Western democracies. It doesn't have to be this way, and we can turn the corner. In fact, you can go around the country and see places where they have made changes. Los Angeles is such a place. New York, big time, is such a place. They used to have huge murder rates, and the detectives got their act together finally and started clearing cases. And you'll see, if you go to our data sets, you'll see a tremendous decline in the murder rate. It doesn't have to be this way. We just have to be smarter in how we employ police and fund police and hold police accountable. We just have to be better at this.
I mean,
And
do
we
you,
always have to cooperate.
you know, the George Floyd murder, is that rippling out, and do you think it'll eventually will go back to normal? I mean, how do you see this murder spree increasing before it gets better?
I don't know. So we've only recognized, this is called an exogenous effect, something that happens from the outside. For years, criminology came up with models that would try to predict who would be capable of murder, and thereby you'd have a sense of what a murder rate is likely to be. This is totally outside of our knowledge base. We don't understand what these forces are. Okay, so if Ferguson was one of the first times we recognized an exogenous effect, an effect totally unrelated to the education level of the people, what the crime level in a neighborhood is, what the childhood experiences were of someone. This was something that caused people who otherwise might not have committed murder to commit murder. And it's not in anyone's model to explain why that was. And if Ferguson was the first time we had a measurable exogenous effect, then the hope is that the current surge will subside the way the Ferguson effect seemed to be subsiding. We had a surge happening around 2015, 2016, and then it seemed to decline a little bit in 2017, 18, 19. And then Mr. Floyd gets murdered, and it just zoomed. And we've never seen such a rapid increase in homicide. So the honest answer is, I don't know, but I pray. I'm a good Episcopalian. I pray that we stop killing each other at this kind of rate.
Do you compare the murder rate to other countries and see any relationship to the numbers in other places?
Not really. You're half as likely, at least half as likely, to be murdered in Canada as you are here. It's much lower all across Northern Europe. In fact, you're more likely to be hit by lightning than you are to be murdered in several major democratic countries. That ain't the way it is here. It is really without precedent. I mean, in democratic governments that are well run, we're not supposed to be killing each other at this rate. And it's embarrassing, along with it being appalling.
Yeah.
But we should be much better at law enforcement. The whole world sends their detectives to the United States to study the latest techniques. And what's weird about that is countries where they clear 70, 80, 90% of their murders are sending their detectives here, where last year we cleared 54%. To learn.
Why are they coming here? Why do they send them here? We have good techniques, we're just not using them, or what's the issue?
Or good restaurants, and you know what I mean?
Okay.
Yeah, it's lovely to come here. It's because of our technology.
Yeah.
The United States leads the world in DNA research. We have a lot of things going for us, and yet we have perhaps among the worst murder rates anywhere in the world.
So it's the will of, it's depressing. It's just really upsetting. I think, just for the audience, though, I think you said something earlier, and you've said it twice now, which is to encourage people, like, how do we hold our cities, our, police accountable, right? What can we do as an everyday citizen to demand something better? We have the right to not be murdered. As a society.
Very complicated. It's very complicated, though, because we've also had these movements to defund the police. So now the police don't actually, they don't go into the cities as much. So at least that's what we're seeing in Minnesota, is that, you just don't have the police going in because they're not respected. There is no relationship between the citizenry and the community, the police
Right.
community. So it's unintended consequences,
Yeah.
maybe society lurching forward in some unclear way, or maybe lurching backwards,
Yeah. Yeah, it's called depolicing. The phenomenon is that for whatever reason, police cannot do their historic job. And clearly that's part of the problem. One of the measures of depolicing is the clearance rate for major crimes. And clearly that has happened. We have to turn things around. And when I say we, I mean we, all of us, every one of us.
Yeah.
So a cop knocks on your door and tells you, well, Mrs. Mahulahan got robbed and killed last night. What did you hear? What did you see? And really, we are required by any kind of ethical system to assist and cooperate and speak up, that we get the kind of communities we deserve. And so we need to fight for our neighborhoods and demand that those who commit crime be held accountable, and to hold our police to a standard. We don't want police acting as anti-crime warriors. We want them acting as guardians. That every cop's job is just to grab everyone who seems to be misbehaving and put them before a judge and let the judge sort them out. That's what the law is. And guardianship is the way to go. Every cop, I think, instinctively knows that. We just have these unfortunate events that have led to a narrative that police cannot be trusted. And we have to change that. All of us have to change that. Or, we're going to continue to die. So literally, we're trying to save our own lives.
Well, thank you for coming on and sharing this with us. It's a sobering message. Appreciated your time very much.
Yeah, thank you both. I love the work you do. I'm sorry this is not a whole lot of laughs, is it? And yet, if I can give hope, there's every reason to hope that we've seen in lots of places the murder rate go down. When a politician promises to do something about major crime and we elect him or her, they usually try. And just the effort alone usually is associated with a decline in the rate of murder. I mean, it absolutely can be done. It doesn't have to be this way. We just have to make it a priority.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Much. And everybody, please go and check out this website.
Yeah.
Murderdata.org.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, you guys.
Okay.